A new Resident Evil must have been an exciting prospect when the Dreamcast and PS2 were on the horizon. The possibilities of what could be done with the newer, more powerful hardware must have got people's imaginations running. Bigger environments, more hideous looking enemies, a more ambitious story perhaps. Would it push the series forward a little bit like Resident Evil 3 did, or just keep the status quo? Most sequels aim for the bigger and better school of logic, and whilst Code Veronica is definitely bigger, it's not really better. Resident Evil 2 and 3 leapt off the original and explored some new ideas whilst keeping the core relatively familiar and improving on some of the previous game's flaws, which in my opinion is what a good sequel should do. Code Veronica on the other hand just gave you a much longer experience, but it seemed to double down on the previous entry's problems, which I'll expand on later, but let's get the story and setup out the way first. So you play as Claire again, and the game opens with Claire infiltrating an Umbrella facility looking for Chris. How she infiltrated it on her own is a mystery, but I'll roll with it. She's getting shot at, fearlessly dodging bullets, doing badass action chick stuff. Eventually, she is captured and taken to Rockford Island, an Umbrella prison facility. The island is attacked and the prison guard lets her go, since it's likely she'll die anyway, and from there you have to get Claire off the island. Quite early on you meet Steve Burnside, the game's support character and also biggest problem. He's just a total tosser. He sounds like a 10-year-old who's got his balls in a wrench all the time. You expect him to get his Beyblades and Pokemon cards out at any point. And he just says the stupidest stuff. For example,
"You see? This thing is a lot more reliable than any person."
that's the kind of thing someone would say before they go and shoot up a high school. Thankfully he dies near the end, spoiler alert, but he's there all the way through the game talking bollocks. He's got a backstory. Turns out his dad worked for Umbrella but sold their secrets, which is why he's on the island and has daddy issues. He finds out his dad's been experimented on and has to kill him before he eats Claire in another cringeworthy scene.
Gay!
But let's not make this a Steve is shy video, as the story is actually pretty substantial. It turns out Wesker was the one who attacked the island, you know, that tosser from Resident Evil 1 who wears sunglasses in inappropriate situations, because he wants to capture Alexia Ashford, the island's overseer, and the granddaughter of one of Umbrella's founders, Edward Ashford. She's actually the product of a cloning experiment carried out by her father to recreate the family's renowned Count Veronica, who was an absolute genius. So obviously Wesker wants her for her research and brains. Then there's Alexia's brother Alfred, who is absolute gold. Out of the two, he's the one you meet first. He's just a smarmy little twat. The voice actor suits him perfectly.
Please try and keep me amused, and do not disappoint me by dying too soon. I so want to enjoy this.
Through most of Claire's adventure, he's there to inconvenience the poor girl. He's mental as fuck as well. Turns out Alexia is not on Rockford, and Alfred has been cross-dressing, pretending to be her.
Alfred! You cross-dressing freak!
Careful, Claire, it's 2017, you can't say stuff like that now. And then there's your boy Chris Boulder Punching Redfield, who you play as for the second half of the game following Claire's trail. So there's the story setup. Claire needs to get away from Rockford Island, then the Arctic base, then Chris follows to save her. Now let's talk about those juicy problems. Backtracking is the first pisser. Yes, 1, 2 and 3 had their fair share of it, but Code Veronica has an excessive amount of it. And the problem is confounded by the environments being more suited to a 4-hour Resident Evil game like the PS1 trilogy, rather than a 6 to 8 one like Code Veronica. There's just not enough variety to them. They get so boring because you're constantly coming back through them. Get used to collecting a key that unlocks just a single door, then backtracking across the map to unlock it, find a key in that room, then repeat the process a few more times to unlock the next area. At least most of the keys in the previous entries had keys that unlocked multiple rooms, having loads of keys and items just for one room feels like padding of the shittest order. There's one or two in the game that unlock multiple rooms, but that's it. It can be a bit of an ordeal sorting them all out and figuring out what does what, which brings me nicely on to my next point. Code Veronica to me feels like a game designed to sell walkthroughs. That's not to say you can't get through the game without one, but if you don't on your first run through,
you're gonna have a bad time.
Now why is that, Glenn, you ask? Well, in Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3 you could take a very optimal route through each game, which would result in a quicker finishing time as well as optimal resource usage, but that wasn't necessary because number one, enemies didn't respawn, so if you did take them down you knew a return to an area would at least not result in getting chomped. Code Veronica on the other hand does respawn enemies. Number two, if you explored enough you could get enough stuff to survive. Resources were just scarce enough depending on what difficulty you had it on, but Code Veronica has no difficulty settings, and it has very weird resource balancing issues. In the early game there is not enough ammo or health items, but in the late game there's loads of trash ammo you will probably never need. Number 3, Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3 were fair with their enemy placement, for the most part. Code Veronica however isn't really. Plenty of sections have enemies placed where it seems either impossible to get around them or you have to sacrifice some health or ammo. And with the dodgy resource balancing and respawns it can get infuriating. All three of those can really fuck your day up. If you're wandering around exploring and trying to figure out what you're meant to do, it can turn the game into a massive ammo dump. You have to keep taking down the respawning enemies because you don't have the health items necessary to take the damage, but then eventually you run out of ammo, so then you're knackered. If Resident Evil 3's dodge system was in this, it would make it a lot more pleasant. Good mastery of the controls and playing smart in the other three games could get you out of most situations unscathed. In Code Veronica though, it just doesn't feel that way. Not all the time, mind, but through a lot of it, it does. To add even more to my walkthrough bait argument, some of the obtuse things you have to do just to unlock minor resources is a bit absurd. For example, to get the submachine guns for Chris, right, you have to find some hemo medicine as Claire in the first part of the game, then go back to the guard who lets you out at the start of the game, give him your lighter and the hemo medicine. When you take control of Chris, you meet him, but he gets eaten by the worm. You then have to kill the worm as quickly as possible to rescue him and receive the lighter. You then use the lighter to light a fire and get the guns, and like a tit, I left the lighter in the metal detector near the start of the game. Luckily I used a walkthrough, so I managed to go back and get it as Claire, but if you didn't use one you really wouldn't know the lighter was that important. So to put a finer point on it, the optimal route in the previous games was nice to learn once you played through the game a few times, but it wasn't necessary. But in Code Veronica it seems to be. I could see some people needing to restart the game at points, which is something you never needed to do in 1, 2 or 3. Some people will be okay with it, I'm sure, but I'm bloody not. And then there's the absolutely horribly designed boss fights in this game, which are just cheap rather than challenging. Nosferatu really cheesed my onions. You unlock a sniper rifle right before this encounter. It gets taken away right after, so it's the only time you use it. So what does the game do? Lock you in a very close encounter with loads of fog, defeating the whole point of a fucking sniper rifle, and the scope is in a W shape, so it's a twat to aim. Then there's the Steve boss fight, if you can call it that. You just have to run across a room. That sounds simple, right? No! He's faster than you and kills you in 2 quick swings from fine status. The game gives you an indication that you need to run, but then when you do run, he catches up and kills you. So what do, you ask? Well, either you take loads of health items and just tank it, or use the grenade launcher to stun him, but then you can't give it back to Chris for the last half an hour of the game, and believe me, it's useful for that part. Or you can try and run at him to dodge his attack, then run when his back's turned, but that's not guaranteed to work. When I got to this section, I realised that this epitomised Code Veronica, really. You're getting fucked no matter what you do. Yes, in a situation like the one Claire and Chris are in, you wouldn't last long, would you? But as a game, that's not satisfying. In the other games, you could see where you went wrong mostly. Notice I said mostly, they weren't perfect, but this just feels like you're smashing your head against a brick wall. It It's all well and good making a hard game, but your challenge has to be tough but fair, not shitely designed artificial difficulty like this game. When I was checking online, plenty of people did agree with this, and obviously you get the other wanks who are like, "Oh my god, this game is so easy, even a child could finish it, you noob." Just admit it, you sad virgin, you haven't finished it or even played it, you just want to look cool on an internet forum. Obviously I finished it because I'm wicked at video games, but Code Veronica still felt like a step back in the gameplay department to me. There are things I like though. The camera is a lot better, it pans with your movements, giving you a much better view of your surroundings, and there isn't that slight pause when you move from one camera angle to the next like in the other games. The overall darkness of the game is a nice change as well. It adds a lot to the atmosphere. I always wondered why everywhere was so well lit in the first three. Being able to switch targets whilst aiming was also pretty useful, but all the gameplay innovations 3 made were suddenly forgot for Code Veronica. So yeah, it's a bit poo. If you're playing through the series, go through this with a walkthrough just to get the story. After Code Veronica, the Resident Evil remake and Zero came out. I've already reviewed Zero when it was released in HD, but to give a quick overview, whilst the Resident Evil remake is amazing, Zero was clearly a sign the series was running out of ideas, and it needed a bit of a kick up the arse. Thankfully, Resident Evil 4 definitely was, which I will talk about in the next part. Actually, 2 Outbreak games came out before 4, but I'll cover them in the final part, covering the more spin-offy types of games like Survivor.